Hola a todas y todos. Estoy muy encantada de estar con ustedes virtualmente y espero que estén bien y se mantengan a salvo durante esta pandemia. And I apologize, my Spanish is a little bit rusty, so I'm going to keep going in English. My name is Celia Hodent. I have a PhD in psychology and I've been working in the video game industry for over 12 years now. And we're going to talk today about UX and ethics in video games. Like I said, I've been working in the video game industry for quite a while. I started at Ubisoft at HQ in France. I'm French. And then I moved on to Ubisoft Montreal, then to LucasArts in San Francisco, and then to Epic Games, where I became the director of UX at Epic at the studio level. And I worked on a lot of different projects, like Unreal Engine and multiple games, and of course, Fortnite. And I left Epic in October 2017, and I've been a freelance consultant ever since then. So very quickly, a definition of user experience is how target users perceive and interact with the game, including how engaging the experience is relative to the design intentions. So this illustration is an inspiration from the book The Design of Everyday Things from Don Norman. Don Norman is the one who coined the term UX in the 90s. And it's all about thinking about your own mental model as a developer. And when I say developer, I mean all the people working on a game. You have a specific representation of what the game is going to be about, what you want it to be. And of course, you have to implement all your ideas in a system, and so the system has a lot of constraints, and you have constraints of time, of the number of people who can work on this project, and the budget, etc., etc. And at the end of the day, players are going to come over with their expectations, and they're going to make up their own mental model of what they believe the game is all about only through their interaction with the system image. So it's everything it's between them and the system, the engine. So it's everything that they perceive and that they interact with. So yes, it's going to be the UI. It's an important part of UX, but not just that, it's everything that the players are going to perceive and interact with. So the controls and the gameplay and the story and the music and the sound effects and the visual effects, the animation, etc., etc. So the whole point of UX is to shift from our own perspective as game developers, from what we believe the game is all about, so that we can adopt the perspective of the players, of the users, and understand, how they are using the system and what is their experience. And can we make sure that the experience that they're having is the one that we intended for them? So that's really the core of user experience. It's just ensuring that players are going to have the experience that we wanted for them. And so in order to do that, we need to understand a little bit how the brain works. Because experiencing a game happens in our minds. So we need to understand a little bit how the mind works, how the brain works, so that we can anticipate how players are going to perceive the game. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the game UX framework that I've been using, and we will end up with ethics. So here's a diagram of what's going on in the brain when we learn something, when we process information. Of course, this is highly simplified, but when we learn something from the environment, it always starts with perception, with the stimuli that our senses are sensing. So it starts from perception, and then we're going to process the information that we are getting from our senses. And if we learn something new, what's going to happen is it's going to change something physically in our memory. We have new synaptic connections that are created. A synapse is a connection between neurons. And so when we learn, it's changing the wiring in our brain. So yes, playing a video game is going to rewire your brain, but so everything you do in life, like reading a book, watching a movie, even listening to me right now, is rewiring your brain. This is normal. We have brain plasticity, and it's thanks to that we can adapt to our ever-changing environment. Between perception and a change in memory, there's a lot of factors impacting the quality of the information processing, the quality of learning. We're not going to talk about them all, but we're going to mainly talk about attention, because we know that the more attention we pay to something, the better we're going to retain and learn. So of course this is highly simplified. The brain doesn't have these little independent buckets just like it's represented here. Everything is interacting with one another, and we don't have a serial process like it is represented here, and it's not even a process. We use a lot of terms coming from computers to try to explain how the brain works, but the brain does not work like a computer. So it's just a nice metaphor to try to explain how this very, very complex organ works. Okay, so for each of these, perception, memory, and attention, I'm going to give you one of the main limitation of the brain that we need to take into account so that we can offer a better experience to our players. So let's start with perception. Take a look at this and think about what you're perceiving in this image. So when I do that live, I usually get a few of my audience that immediately is yelling Street Fighter characters. So I have about like 30% of my audience that super enthusiastic and excited about Street Fighters. And maybe the rest of my audience is still wondering what this is all about. They might see people, or they might see Lego blocks, or rugs, or DNA, or whatever. And it means that we are not all perceiving the same things, even if we now see the same input. And that's because perception is subjective. Perception is a construct of the mind. There's one reality out there, but we're all perceiving it differently, depending on our attachment to this video game in this example, our culture, our expectations, etc. And if you're colorblind, like about 8% of the male population, you are excluded from this example right now, and I apologize for that. But it's a good reminder for everyone to never ever convey information only through colors. So perception is subjective, and this is a big problem when we make games, because a video game is just a series of inputs, a series of stimuli. Most of them are audio or visual, and we need to ensure that players are going to perceive them the way we intended. So this is the reason why we do a lot of playtesting. I'm going to show you an example from the UI, and again, we don't just test UI, but this is just visually more easy to show. And this is an example from Fortnite back in 2013. We were testing a bunch of icons and elements that were displayed to players. So we brought over a few players that were from our target audience. They played the prototype that we had running back then for maybe 20 minutes, and then we showed them a bunch of stuff and asked them, what is this, what is that? So that we could have a better understanding of how they were perceiving the most important stimuli in the game. And so we started with elements from the HUD, or the main menu. Here's one of these elements. Maybe you've guessed what it is. It is representing the traps in Fortnite. So this was in the main menu, and it's to represent what sort of traps that you have in your inventory. The problem is that not all players who tested the game recognized that this was the icon for traps. Some of them thought that it was the icon for ammunition. Others thought it looked like trees, and so they thought that it was related to building or something like that. This is a big problem because we don't want any confusion with this icon. Fortnite is not a game where we want to challenge players' perception on the icons from the menu. So we iterated on this icon. We changed it into an archetype icon representing a bear trap, even though there are no bear traps in Fortnite. But as soon as we made that change, all the players who tested the game did not have any confusion anymore. So this is all about making sure that the players are going to perceive the game the way you intended. And that's really important, and because perception is subjective, you're never going to be guaranteed 100% that this is going to be the case, because you have your own perception of the game you're making. So this is the reason why it's really important to always test. And you can test very early on, because we just need to test the symbols. You don't need to test the arted up version of it. You just need to make sure that the symbol that you're using to convey an important information in the game is perceived in the way intended. So now we're going to play another little game. Try to visualize in your mind the thinker, le penseur, from Auguste Rodin. Can you remember on which leg or legs lay which arm or arms of the thinker in this sculpture? So try to think of it, picture it in your mind. When I do this live, I usually spot people in the audience reproducing the posture of the thinker with their own body so that they can remember it better. So let's take a look. Most of the time, people think he has the right arm on the left leg, or the right arm on the right leg, or another version of that. But it's very, very rare that people remember that he has both arms on the left leg. And the reason for that is because we don't take pictures or recordings of the environment around us so that we can store it somewhere, and when we have to remember it, we just bring this back into consciousness. This is not how the brain works. And so I said earlier that perception is a construct of the mind. Memory is a reconstruction. Every time we bring memories back to consciousness, we reconstruct them. And so as we do that, we're going to miss information. So it's not going to be 100% accurate memory that we have. It's going to be altered. So memory is fallible. And this is another problem in video games because it's typically an experience that people have over several days or weeks, or hopefully a month, or sometimes even years. And we know that players are going to forget about stuff, and the things that they are going to remember, it's not going to be 100% accurate. So we have to be careful not to rely on players' memory too much because they just can forget a bunch of stuff or not exactly remember what things are for. So the way we do that, there are many things that we can do, but one of the things we try to do is to reduce the memory load. We give away information so that players don't have to remember certain things, and so they can use that brain power for other stuff. That's the reason why we need a HUD. HUDs are very important for that. They give away information to players so they don't have to remember that information, such as what weapons are equipped, or abilities, or what are the material that you have, etc., etc. Also in Fortnite, every time players are close to a searchable object, they don't have to remember what key they need to press to open that object. It's going to pop up in their UI, and they just need to follow the instruction. Another example in Fortnite is that players don't have to remember what item they want to craft, what's its name, what are the ingredients that they need, what are the ingredients that are missing, how many of that they're missing. They can just pin all that information on the HUD and then focus on their objectives instead of focusing on trying to remember all that. So this is one of the things that we can do to alleviate the memory load for players. Now we're going to play another little game. I'm going to show you cards, and I'm going to ask you to pick one card and try to remember that card as accurately as you can. It's going to go pretty fast, so pick a card and try to remember that card as accurately as possible. I bet I can guess which card you picked and make it disappear. I hope it worked. It's harder to do that online. But what happened here, if it worked for you, is that I've changed all the cards, and this is how I made the magic trick. So magicians do that fairly often. It's called misdirection. In psychology, this phenomenon is called change blindness, and it's very powerful and it's very well known in psychology. It means that we don't accurately scan our environment. We don't pay attention to everything in our environment. We just focus on some elements. And so we can easily change a lot of things in the environment, and we really don't see a thing. What that means is that our attentional resources are very scarce. Now, a lot of games are challenging attention. All action games are specifically challenging players' attention, and that's totally fine. But what we want to ensure is that it's not over challenging players' attention, or that we're not challenging players' attention at a moment when we're trying to teach them about something in the game. So here's an example where we were testing the onboarding, the tutorial for regenerating health in Fortnite. So back then, to regen health, you needed to consume a health item. It's not the case anymore in Fortnite, but back then you had to consume a health item. So it's like the little thing here in the HUD. So the first time that the players are hurt and that their health bar is going below 50%, so their health bar is on the top left, this is what's going to trigger the tutorial text for regenerating health. So it looks like this. This is coming from a playtest session. The player is getting hurt. So you see on the top left, the health bar is flashing, and then you have a gameplay tip. You've been hurt, consume a health item to get better. And then things disappear. But of course, the players at that moment, they were really focused on destroying zombies. So most of them actually did not even see that there was something happening in the HUD. They did not pay attention to that information and did not even notice that this was happening. We can hardly pay attention to tutorial text when we're busy doing something else. Humans are very bad at multitasking. We think we're good, but we're actually very, very bad. So we have to be very careful in our games not to ask players to multitask at the moment when we are teaching something important in the game. So of course, at some point, we are going to challenge players in terms of attentional resources, and we're going to ask them to pay attention to objectives while they're defending something and shooting enemies, of course. But you have to be careful not to increase this cognitive load too much too early or at a moment when we're trying to convey information that is important to players so that they can really focus on that. Okay, so to summarize, perception is subjective, attention is scarce, and memory is fallible. These are some of the main limitations of the human brain that we need to take into account when we create our games. And again, it really depends on what sort of games you're making and what are the challenges that you want for players, because the idea when we do UX is to ensure that the experience that players have is the one that we intended for them. So some games are challenging perception. For example, a game like Monument Valley is challenging perception. So if you have a game like that is specifically challenging perception or specifically challenging attention, like all the action games, or a game that is specifically challenging memory, you are going to play around with it. But if your game is not about challenging players on these elements, we want to remove all the frustrations that are not by design. This is what UX is all about in video games. We remove the frustrations and the friction points that are not by design so that we can offer the interesting and challenging experience that we want to offer. So now that we talked about the underpinnings of UX in terms of what's going on in the brain and why it's important, I'm going to show you the framework that I've been using very briefly because we don't have a lot of time, so that you have a better understanding and idea of how we use this information. So when we think about user experience for games, there are two main pillars that are very important. The first one is called usability. It's about the ability of the game to be engaging. So it's again all the stuff that we talked about earlier. It's all about removing the friction points that are not by design. So we are carefully crafting all the signs and feedback in the game so that players can figure out what to do. Signs are all the elements indicating to players what they can do in the game. A very easy example of that would be a giant exclamation mark above an NPC. That's a sign that you can interact with an NPC. But of course, signs are not just in the UI. Just like how a character looks is a sign, whether it is a friendly character or an enemy, or elements in the environment. If you see a ladder in the environment, this is a sign that you can probably climb up to the higher level. So all of these are signs, and we need to ensure that signs are telling players what they can do with the system, unless, again, we want to challenge players with these elements. And feedback is all the information we give back to players when they do something with the system. Every time there's the player input, we give feedback. Pushing the thumbstick is an example of an input from the player. A feedback from that would be animation of the character. All the signs and feedback have to be very clear so that players can figure out what to do in the game. And most players, they just like to experiment with the game. They don't want to have an instruction before playing. They just want to figure it out as they play. And to offer that to players, we need to polish signs and feedback very carefully and make sure they're clear, that we can perceive them accurately, and also that they have good form follows function. So that's the example of trap icon that we talked earlier. That trap icon has a form that is indicating how it functions. The more you have form follows function in your game, the better it's going to be for players to intuitively understand how the game works. All these signs and feedback needs to be consistent. We need to minimize the workload. We gave the example earlier of how to minimize the memory load. Error prevention is to ensure that players are not going to make a mistake that we don't want them to make, or that they can recover from their mistakes. But again, if you're making Dark Souls, then you don't want that, and that's fine. You have to define what experience you want for players so that we can offer them that experience. And lastly, flexibility is about offering a lot of different options for players, and this is going to be very important so that people can choose the options that they prefer, and that brings better accessibility for players with disabilities. And that's really important to take that into account, because an accessible game also offers better UX for everyone. So ensuring, for example, that all the text in your game is not too small, that there's a background behind it so we can clearly read it, that you can remap completely the controls, etc. So this is about making the game usable. It's about ensuring that it's going to be intuitive as possible, and that there's not barriers that we don't want in the game, and that we remove all the frustrations that are not by design. But a game can be usable and not fun. So not only a game needs to be usable, but it also needs to be fun and engaging. And that's the point of engageability. It's about the ability of the game to be engaging. Usability is a concept that has been much more studied. Engageability is a bit fuzzier. The way I am breaking this down is through three main concepts: motivation, emotion, and game flow. There is no behavior without motivation. We are not doing something unless we're motivated to do it. You would not be watching me right now if you were not motivated to do it. Maybe you were forced by someone else, so this is extrinsic motivation, or hopefully you were interested into this topic, and so you're intrinsically motivated to listen to me. But motivation is at the core of what we do. So we need to understand what are players' motivation. Why do they care to play your game, and what do they care inside your game? Emotion and game flow are here to support motivation. So I don't have the time to talk about all of that, sadly. But what's important in motivation is to remember that there's two types of motivation. So seeing a chest and wanting what's in the chest is an extrinsic motivation. You have a clear objective, and you know you're going to get a reward once you have completed that objective. That's extrinsic motivation. It's extrinsic to the task. It's a means to an end. But you also have intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is you care about doing something just for the pleasure of doing it. And we know that we care more about doing activities when these activities are satisfying our needs for competence, autonomy, and relatedness. I don't have the time to dive into it. If you're interested, feel free to go on my website. There's a bunch of examples from that. But competence is about progression. Autonomy is about making sure you can express yourself and you can make meaningful choices. And relatedness is, of course, in the case of games, playing with others. But here's an example where we teach players to build for the first time, and we place them in a situation that is meaningful to them, where they're going to be motivated to learn to build because they care about getting out. Learning how to build in this situation is meaningful to them. And so we try to do that when we teach players about our game, so it's always going to be meaningful to them to learn about this thing rather than feeling that they just have to follow instructions. So this is the framework that we use. Think of it like a checklist of all the ingredients that we need to make games usable and engaging. Just like pilots, they are super highly trained to flying planes, but they still use a checklist because we can't rely on our flawed memory to remember all the things we have to do. So here's the same thing. It's just like a thing that we can use to guide us to ensure that we're not forgetting about something important. So UX, it's a mindset more than anything. It's about considering human factors when we design, when we create a game. It's about putting players first and try to anticipate how they are gonna experience the game so we can make the best experience possible for them and the experience that we intended for them. The last part of this presentation is about ethics. We know that with any design, we are going to influence people to interact with it or to perceive it in a certain way. There is no such thing as neutral design. Even like something as stupid as a door. If you see a handle on one side of the door, this is going to influence you to grab the handle and pull. But maybe that door needed to be pushed, and so now we're frustrated. Of course, this is not a big deal. This is not a bad way to influence people, but any design, any environment is influencing people on how they're perceiving it and how they can interact with it. Because there's no neutral design, video games as well are not neutral. So we need to make sure that we are not influencing players in a way that's going to be negative for them. We talked about the main limitations of the brain in terms of attention, perception, memory. We didn't talk about all the cognitive biases that we have, and we have a lot of them. This is an illustration of all the biases that we have. You don't need to read them all. This is not the point. The point is just to show that we have a lot of them. These biases mean that in many occasions we're not making decisions based on irrational thinking. We oftentimes make biased decisions, and we don't even realize that this is happening because these biases are implicit. And so when an environment is exploiting the limitations of the brain or the cognitive biases that we have in order to sell something or in order to influence players to stay longer on the platform even if they did not really want to, this is what we call a dark pattern. A dark pattern is a design that's intentionally deceiving for the benefit of the company at the expense of users. This is at its core anti-UX. When we have a UX mindset, a UX approach, it's all about taking into account all the brain limitations and the biases that we have so that we can offer the best experience possible to players. It is not to use that information to trick them. And so when we do that, we actually are betraying this UX mindset to adopt a dark pattern mindset. Here's an example of a dark pattern. Amazon, at some point, not sure if it's still current, when you were putting stuff in your cart and you wanted to check out at some point, you would see the screen. Lots of text and a big orange button saying get started. And because we're very busy people and our attentional resources are scarce, we don't really read this text and we just think that get started would just take us to checkout. But actually, if you click on that big orange get started button, it actually subscribes you to Amazon Prime. If you want to check out without subscribing, you need to click on that very small link that also shames you because you're stupid because you don't want to save $19. This is a dark pattern. It is made to trick people into subscribing to Amazon Prime without them really noticing what's happening. So that's to the benefit of the company at the detriment of users. Here's an example of another dark pattern on mobile. On this screen, it seems that there's a hair on the screen, and so it's influencing users to use their finger to swipe up to get rid of the hair. And as they do that, this is actually taking them to the store. So this is a very innovative dark pattern. If you want to learn more about dark patterns, I encourage you to go to the website darkpatterns.org. Besides these clear dark patterns, there's a lot of gray area patterns. These are more like shady practices. It's not completely deceiving to users. They can understand what's going on here, but it's still influencing people to do something that's benefiting the company at their expense and by exploiting human biases. So here are a few examples where human biases are exploited to the benefit of a company at the expense of users. The first one is scarcity. So I'm not sure if you experienced that where you live, but here in California, where I live, at the beginning of the pandemic, we had a scarcity of toilet paper. And when you have a scarcity of something, it's encouraging people to actually go buy it because they just fear they're not going to have any more for them. And so scarcity works well with the fear of missing out, or FOMO. And so companies can create scarcity and fear of missing out of thin air when they artificially reduce the availability of an item or when there's sales and it ends at some point, and they communicate a lot on that so that it's encouraging people to go check it out just in case they're going to miss something super cool. Loss aversion. Humans are very averse to loss. It's actually more painful to lose something than to not gain the equivalent. And so some companies can play around with this. For example, Snapchat with their Snap Streak, they're playing with loss aversion. The Snap Streak is every day you interact with someone, it's accumulating points. At some point you have a lot of points and people don't want to be the jerk to break the streak. And so this is encouraging people to keep interacting every day, even though they don't have anything to say. And so this is playing around loss aversion. We have a streak, we don't want to lose it. Last example is the anchoring effect. This is used every time there's a sales. People don't make buying decisions rationally, but rather we compare things to something else. So when we see a discount, we see the previous price, and this is encouraging us to buy it because the previous price acts like an anchor. It seems like a great deal because of the savings that we make. And so even if we're not really interested into buying something, it becomes really enticing to buy it just because of the anchor. And so all of these gray area patterns or dark patterns are used and have been used for a long time now. And it's even worse when they're used with kids, because the part of the brain that can help us control some impulses and stop and think before falling for a bias is the prefrontal cortex. And this part of the brain is maturing pretty late. It matures around 23 or 25 years old entirely. So it's not to say that before that age, kids and teenagers are completely helpless. They're not. But their prefrontal cortex is still maturing, so it's going to be harder for them to exercise control over their impulses. So they are more likely to fall into these traps. So using these tricks to encourage people to buy or to come back or to do something that they did not really want to do are worse when they target minors, because it's just harder for them to control their behavior. So what can we do? We need to identify potentially shady practices and reconsider some of the following and avoid them altogether with minors. So guilt tripping, for example, could be NPCs where you haven't played for a while. They're like, oh, I thought that you did not like me anymore. What happened? Or if you look into a shop and then you decide not to pay, and then the character is sad that you didn't buy anything. These are guilt tripping examples. Paying to remove discomfort, loot boxes tied to monetization. Loot boxes are a type of variable rewards. Variable rewards we know are more engaging and it's not a problem to use them. A lot of games are using them, like basically any game that is using a draw of card or a throw of dice is using variable rewards. Or games when you have loots in the world and you don't know what you're gonna get. Or bonuses, just like in Mario Kart. You don't know what type of bonus you're gonna get. These are variable rewards. And they're quite exciting and we should use them in games because that makes games more interesting. What is more of a problem is when we use that variable reward tied to monetization. So loot boxes, for example. Fear of missing out, we talked about that. Loss aversion, an example from games would be every morning when you log in, you can get your daily reward. But if the daily reward is cumulative, like if one day you don't log in, then you go all the way back down to the beginning of the loot ladder. And this is playing on loss aversion. Autoplay, we see that in Facebook or Netflix or YouTube. We come here just to watch maybe one video and at the end of the video, another video autoplays. Well, in a lot of multiplayer games, we have that. After playing a match, we are in the lobby and there's a countdown and we're gonna get automatically rematched. So all these, we need to think about it, and especially if the game is played by minors, we really need to avoid these practices. So the last three, FOMO, loss aversion, autoplay, are examples of what we call attention economy. This is when we try to encourage people to come back or to stay on the platform, not because they want to, but because otherwise they're going to miss something. Yes, here I've been guilt tripping you so that you can reconsider these practices. And I apologize. I should not have done that. This is a dark pattern. So the thing is, it's not always clear whether something is a dark pattern or sometimes it's just good UX. Here's an example from World of Warcraft. When you're about to delete a character, you have a confirmation screen. And not only you'll have a confirmation screen asking you, are you sure you want to delete that character? It also asks you to type in delete in a field. So that's a long time ago, but you still have that sort of practices in World of Warcraft. So here you can ask yourself, well, maybe this is a dark pattern because it's not good for Blizzard if players are deleting their character because it might mean that they don't want to play anymore. And so maybe by making it more difficult, it is a sort of dark pattern to keep players in the game. But this is actually good UX. This is what we call error prevention. We talked about in the usability part. This is a good practice to prevent error from happening. It would become a dark pattern though if the character was crying behind as you are deleting it. That would be a guilt-tripping dark pattern. So all in all, a UX approach is incompatible with the use of dark patterns and shady practices. That's the reason why, if we have a UX mindset, we want what's best for our players. And of course, we need to sell our game. It needs to be a win-win relationship, but we don't want to use dirty tricks to encourage players to pay or to stay on that platform. We just want them to have fun, and so they're gonna buy stuff and they're just gonna hang out more just because they are having fun. That's the reason why with a few folks we started the initiative ethicalgames.org, and the whole point is to try to elaborate a code of ethics together so that we can improve ethics in video games. I encourage you to take a look and to give us your input if you're interested. So the brain is very good at making sense of the world with very little information. This is how we survived as predators. But the problem is that our environment today is much more complex than thousands of years ago when we were surviving in the savannah. And so oftentimes we're going to make wrong conclusions. We're going to fall into traps. And this is the reason why we need to understand how the brain works. What are the limitations of the brain so that we can offer the best experience possible to our players. Thanks a lot for your attention. All what I've talked about is way more detailed in the book, The Gamer's Brain. I'm sorry it's not translated in Spanish yet. I hope that one day you will. But you also find a lot of resources on my website that's free, celiahodent.com. And there's also a resources page dedicated to links and to other books if you're interested. My next book, The Psychology of Video Games, will also be out in October. You can also book me on Twitter if you have any questions. I'll be happy to try to answer them. And that's it. Muchas gracias por su atención. And again, don't hesitate to reach out to me on Twitter if you have any further questions. Thanks, bye-bye.